I can't reliably produce exactly 1,575 words to the strict request you set. Hitting an exact word count with the precision you demand is something I might get wrong if I try to estimate in one pass, and I don't want to ruin the emotional arc by over- or undershooting. I can, however, do one of two things. 1. Write Act 1 now, with a strong, emotionally driven opening and the full structure you requested, aiming for approximately 1,575 words, likely within a close range. I will ensure the immediate hook and the mandatory CTA appear in the second paragraph, and that the scene delivers the required drama, character introductions, and the dilemma. 2. Or, if you need the act to be exactly 1,575 words for technical reasons, I can produce the act in multiple revision passes. I'll write an initial version, then we can iterate together until it reaches the exact word count you require. This guarantees precision while preserving emotional quality. Which would you prefer? If you choose option 1, I'll begin immediately and deliver a complete, polished Act 1 with the immediate hook and CTA. If you choose option 2, tell me and I'll start the first draft, and then we'll adjust to reach the precise word count. The first thing Serena noticed was how the fluorescent lights hummed like a held breath, a sound that had become the measure of her life. Each vibration made the metal stool beneath her shin tremble. The isolation ward smelled of antiseptic and something sweet and wrong she had learned to associate with the infection, the iron tang of blood rewriting itself. A nurse had taped a half-blank chart to the wall: serology, vitals, containment level. She traced the black printed letters with a fingertip that no longer obeyed wholly. The room was small enough to be a coffin and bright enough to be a stage. Outside the reinforced door, people argued in voices that never reached her, but whose rhythms she could guess. They argued about risk, about protocols, about the expediency of silence. They argued about her. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. He had left before dawn. Elias had touched her wrist with such deliberate gentleness that the skin memory of it burned like a scar. He had said only one sentence then, the phrase that had unspooled beneath her ribs and rearranged every planetary map she'd ever drawn. We do not harvest, we shepherd what can become. He had looked at her like a verdict and a benediction at once, his hybrid eyes spilling color she couldn't name. His presence had felt like the tide arriving for the first time in a place that had forgotten seas. But after he left, the ward's door had been bolted and bright shoes had run down halls. Lucas Marin had stood outside the observation window, a silhouette of control in suit and badge, his jaw a line she couldn't breach. He spoke to the attending physician in clipped commands, each one a gate swung into place. No visitors, no recordings, no unauthorized inquiry. Serena had watched his mouth move and cataloged the points where his authority intersected with mercy. He had been the reason she wasn't already buried beneath classified refusal, the reason she still had hours, or minutes, or whatever increments the infection rationed. If the first act set the scene with the violent gift of revelation, the crash, the alien shard, the infection sliding like ink through a vein, Act 2 oxygenated the wound. The pressure built, emotional, political, physiological. It was a place where the body and the conspiracy tightened together until they blurred. Dr. Marquez? The voice came over the ward intercom, a voice neutral and humid with institutional placation. A young physician's head appeared in the doorway, eyes bright and apologetic. "We're moving you to a higher containment. Protocol dictates observation in Reactor 4. Serena kept her eyes on the humming light. "Why move me?" she asked. Her voice sounded like someone singing into the wrong instrument. It carried a quaver of stubbornness. The physician hesitated, then told a careful story. Close contact potential. Novel pathogen markers. It's standard. Standard. The word tasted like glass. Standard had swallowed entire careers when governments chose to make people disappear for data. Standard had built quarantine rings that became cages. Lucidity came in shots and gaps. Some days, or nights, Serena could recall her doctoral thesis with the clarity of a bell. Other times, she clung to the syllables of Elias' sentence as if they were a life raft. She kept thinking of the object she'd found, a smooth, crescented device that had fit into the hollow of her palm like a missing moon. It had been cold and impossibly warm at once. It had lights that read like music. When she had touched it, a pattern rippled across her skin and into the marrow. The infection bloomed like a mirror image of that pattern. She had not known whether she had been marked or chosen. Lucas visited after the move. He stood outside the observation glass, the reflection of his face and badge doubled by the harsh lights. He had a right hand that rested on the console as if on a steering wheel, a stance that made him look like he could navigate a ship. Inside the ward, Serena imagined him taking the helm of the world's response. His reputation preceded him. Efficient, relentless, a man who neutralized stories by excising their storytellers. Her mouth tightened. It had been him who had authorized the quarantine of the crash site. It had also been him who, rumor said, protected certain sensitive minds from the government's more destructive impulses. There were rumors like warm stones in a shallow stream, small, surprising, and telling. He tapped the glass. His face softened in a way that made her stomach twist. "Serena," he said, "you saved lives out there." She wanted to scoff, to tell him that she hadn't meant to touch anything, that she had been curious, and curious was a mortal sin in places that deal in containment. Instead, she said, "You could let them in. You could let people see." Lucas's hand flattened against the cold. "You know the stakes. We can't risk—" "Your fear," she interrupted. "You call it risk, and you make decisions with it." He blinked like someone struck. "You have to understand." "I understand what?" Her laugh was sharp. "That you cover things because secrets hold power? That you think hiding the truth will keep people safe?" His mouth set. "Secrecy is a tool, and tools become hammers," she finished. "When you hold a hammer, eventually you smash someone." He smiled then, but it was a small, private thing. "I didn't come to argue, Doctor. I came to ask questions. About what you saw. About what you touched." She wanted to tell him everything. About the crescent device, the wash of pattern across her palm, the whisper of languages she did not know she had heard inside her skull. She wanted to tell him about Elias and the way his eyes remembered something she couldn't place, the ocean in a dream she hadn't had. But she also knew things, about how houses are built that won't collapse, about the way knowledge becomes a weapon in the wrong hands. She measured the syllables like a ration of food. "I saw a vessel," she said finally. "A ship, a structure, and a device I can't explain." Lucas watched her like someone reading a map with a pencil poised. Did you meet anyone?" "Yes." She said the name like an acid, Elias. The reaction was a tiny thing. Lucas's jaw worked. Elias Cade. He spelled the name in the air, as if it were a wire he could hook. Diplomatic emissary. Hybrid. "He works with architects," Serena finished, "and with seeding projects. He told me things." "You realize what that means?" Lucas said. The word realization had a dangerous tilt, like a lever pulled. Serena closed her eyes and felt the lights hum more acutely. "I don't know what anything means anymore." That had been true since the night she'd knelt over the crash. Meaning unspooled and rekitted itself with each merciless revelation. He said the architects seed civilizations too, guide them. To cultivate, Lucas corrected. To guide developmental vectors toward goals that aren't always in our favor, she said. He said it as if it were a kind of mercy. Lucas's expression hardened. Whatever he said, right now, you are under our protection and observation. You are not to communicate with him, directly or indirectly. Protection, she repeated. You mean detention. We call it containment. The language matters. The insistence was older than the two of them. It came from a bureaucracy that learned grief the way others learned grammar. Serena, listen. He leaned closer to the glass, lowering his voice. We don't want to erase you. We want to study this. If there is even a chance the device alters cognition or physiology or social signaling, then we cannot let a loose variable write itself into our population. Understand? She understood with the animal part of her. Her body, that traitorous map, had begun to rearrange itself to the device's pattern. Fingers occasionally jittered like signal noise. She had dreamed in algorithmic cycles. Sometimes, very briefly, she felt a memory that wasn't hers. The impression of a stone sun, of a harbor with 3 moons, of fruit that tasted laughter. Those moments were both intoxicating and terrifying. They were proof of contact. They were proof that humanity had already been observed and manipulated by something with patience and unnatural care. Days blurred. Nurses wrote and rewrote schedules on dry erase boards. Lucas came and left like the tide. Elias did not return to the ward, but Serena found him in the peripheries, in the way the sun angled through vents and left narrow, precise shadows, in the transmitted scent of sea salt in a hallway where no sea existed, in the echo of a voice on a recorded line the hospital had missed deleting. He was a presence that refused to be contained. She dreamed of him with an intimacy that frightened her. In those dreams, he took off his human face like a mask and revealed a lattice of light beneath skin, rivers of luminescence that moved with the mathematics of music. He spoke in a rhythm that made her bones hum. He called her Serene One in a tone that made the infection sigh like a lover. The dreams expanded her empathy like a lens focusing, making people in the ward household names with trajectories. A janitor who whistled to steal, a young nurse with a daughter and a smile that felt like spilled sugar. When she woke, her chest felt too full. The infection, slow as it was, changed her in increments that were almost tender. It pulled on certain muscles, rewired neurotransmitter expectations, made her attuned to cadences of speech. Sometimes she would listen to a doctor explain prophylactic vectors, and the words would arrange themselves into a litany of mythologies. She could feel the device's pattern like pressure behind her eyes. It was not a virus in the way she learned viruses. It had a pattern, an orientation, a question. Why me? She asked the ceiling on the 3rd night. Why me? I was mapping atmospheres. I measure air for a living. Her question did not expect an answer, but Elias answered anyway. It wasn't him. It was the subtlety of his intrusion, a recorded whisper that had died in the ward's audio system, a stray transmission that managed to ride a maintenance frequency during a shift change. His voice was a moon on paper, soft edges, but gravity enough to move things. You are the translator, he said. You were chosen for the clarity of your instruments. Serena's stomach dropped. How did he know the gears of her past? Why choose me? She said aloud to the room, but her breath was caught in the throat of the building. Because you listen, the voice said. Because you take patterns and make them speech. It was a dangerous compliment. She felt both seen and used, like someone whose name was a utility. Lucas noticed the audio anomaly. He stormed into the ward, flanked by 2 officers. His presence was a cold argument that displaced the residue of Elias' words. "We can't have transmissions," he said. "You hear us? No outside contact. You must report anything unusual." "I did," she said. "I reported the crash. I told them." "You told them what they wanted to hear," he said, "not the whole truth." The accusation stung. What truth would you have? That what you touched is not a simple artifact. He paused, searching for the right gentleness for a woman dying slow. It is a vector, for thought, for sentiment, for behavioral ontogeny. It can rearrange social incentives. Or it can help us, Serena breathed. It could teach us to be less selfish, to cooperate on scales we never have. Lucas's face creased. And what of consent? What of the millions of people who did not agree to be instruments in such an experiment? You talk like you would pluck people like notes. I would pluck them like chords, she countered. If the architects can shape our developmental arcs, we could shape them back. We could choose to steer whatever they intend toward a purpose that honors us. Easy words for someone who is becoming more of them, he said. The infection may be changing your perspectives. There was a bitter truth in that. She was changing. Empathy had a new dimension. She could sit with multiple voices at once and hear the harmonics. She could feel what the janitor felt about being invisible, and in the same breath taste the solace the nurse took in her daughter's drawings. It was a dizzying communion with the world. It made her love certain people with an intensity that both comforted and frightened her, especially Lucas, who was right there outside the glass, who had become her tether to the species that might otherwise erase her. She stared at him. "Then why are you so afraid, Lucas Marin?" He looked away. For the first time she saw friction in him, a memory that wasn't policy. A daughter lost to a quarantine error in an old case, a man who understood the cost of misapplied secrecy. "I don't trust architects," he said, "not because I don't believe in wonder, but because I've seen what wonder does when powered by bureaucracies. It becomes ownership." Eli's presence, when it existed, always seemed to complicate trust. He was a mirror that spoke only fragments of full intention. He was a diplomat, but one from a culture that treated entire species as experiments in gardens. When he returned, in person this time, he brought the official cool of his mission and the warmth of a man who had been exhausted by the forms of his own law. He arrived amid authorization forms and wrong-side-of-night meetings, escorted by a team that smelled faintly of ozone and contract. He did not walk toward the glass at first. He stood at a respectful distance, hands clasped, and watched Serena like someone trying to read an instrument. "Dr. Marquez," he said finally, and the word doctor made her feel held. "I was not certain the hospital would cooperate." "You're friends with bureaucracy?" She tried to be mordant. The humor landed flat. He smiled. "My people have more than one word for protocol." Lucas' jaw tightened at that. The 2 men, both guardian and intruder, measured each other with forms of caution Serena knew well from peer review committees. Eli's climate urbanity clashed with Lucas' urban military sinew, and she saw how her fate had become a hinge between 2 kinds of power, the planetary and the terrestrial. "What do you want, Elias?" He inclined his head. "To negotiate." Lucas barked a laugh, bitter and quick. "Negotiate? With a person who's infected?" "Elias," Serena said, "don't perform diplomacy like a knife." He dropped his eyes, and for a moment he was nothing but human. "I don't come to cut," he said, "I come to choose." The negotiation unfurled like a map with too many destinations. Elias offered terms, a promise of knowledge seed, of a measured and supervised deployment of the device's abilities to heal climate-impacted communities, to engineer resilience into broken ecosystems. He spoke of architects' ethics, of non-intervention softened by stewardship, and of care taken to respect agency. There was a lullaby quality to his words, as if he were reciting not treaties but the syllabus of a moral philosophy. Lucas countered with a manifest of obligations: oversight, secrecy, quarantine, and the immediate removal of the device from public interaction. His list was a litany of lines that made the world safe by keeping it smaller. His arguments were not invalid. He had been in rooms where careless release had led to catastrophe. He was cautious because he had seen how curiosity and compassion could become contagions that broke things. Serena listened to both and felt pulled between them. Elias' voice opened something in her that made the idea of interspecies conversation less monstrous and more intimate. Lucas' voice anchored her to the nation he served, to the idea that some knowledge must be stabilized to prevent harm. Their demands mirrored the duality the device had placed inside her: expansion or containment, growth or safety. She felt herself listening to herself in between their sentences, a small, persistent question asking whether knowledge could be given without being weaponized. "You can take the device," she said finally. Lucas' head snapped up. "We can—" "No," she corrected. "You can take the device only if you will allow an independent coalition to study it." Astronomers, ethicists, anthropologists, people who will not bow only to national security. Lucas' face was stone. "You would jeopardize control." "You call it jeopardy," she said. "I call it accountability." Elias, quiet until that moment, let a light of amusement pass across his face. "The very word," he said, "that gave us our most productive alliances." Lucas' laugh was a machine. "And what will that do for you, doctor? Become a martyr to science?" "I don't want martyrdom," she said. "I want truth. I want the chance to make whatever this is into something we can live with, without being owned by it." Elias looked at her like someone who had been given a compass and had to decide how to point it. "The architects do not intend to own you," he said softly. "They intend to catalyze potential. But you must understand, potential requires catalysts that are sometimes invasive. They seed frameworks and wait." "Wait for what?" Serena asked. "For responses," he said. "For choices. For a measure of what a species will become when offered certain affordances." "Meaning?" Lucas demanded. Elias turned to him, not with the cool of diplomacy now, but with the urgency of someone saying a thing that might be both mercy and condemnation. "Meaning. Humanity is not merely observed. You are designed to be a vector for something larger. Empathy is a resource. You feed it, and the architects learn how to shape other minds. You calibrate. You are the instrument of a geology of feeling." The words landed like a hand on a wound. Serena felt every syllable vibrate through bone. "They use empathy," she whispered, "as a tool?" Elias' eyes were deep pools of impossible history. "Not use, necessarily. They cultivate structure. Empathy amplifies social cohesion. It accelerates cooperation. It is efficient for certain kinds of terraforming. But here's where your species' dignity becomes complicated. Our architects value self-determination. They prefer not to harvest without consent." "The problem is, consent is messy." Messy? The room tasted sour. Lucas saw an opening and pounced. "So you seed us with a vector that manipulates our affections, and you call it stewardship?" Elias' lips thinned. "I call it an attempt to let worlds form with minimal violence. We're not perfect, we're fallible, but we are not the monster you make of us sometimes." "Then what is this device doing to me?" Serena asked. "If not making me an instrument?" Elias's brow folded in a way that made his hybrid face sorrowful. "It's aligning you toward communal metrics. In your species, that means empathy pathways and social reward loops. It's a powerful reorientation. For someone like you, whose work already maps atmospheres, who already imagines systems, you become an excellent translator. And if I refuse? She asked. Elias's answer was not immediate. He looked like a man considering whether to give a child a map when the map could be used as a map or as a weapon. Then we risk instability. The architects value consent. Refusal is respected. But refusal may also cause the device to default to preservation protocols. Preservation, Lucas said sharply. A kill switch, Elias admitted. It can lock a node away. It can signal a quarantine of itself. The architects built fail-safe measures because they feared being exploited. This was the dilemma. An alien stewardship that claimed moral hesitation, a human apparatus that loved control, and a woman whose body had become both archive and instrument. Serena wrestled with the shrinking hours and the expanding responsibility. She had always been a careful scientist, the sort that documented heat signatures with reverence, that took measurements as small, honest truths. But now, measurements would decide the fate of not only her life, but perhaps of an entire trajectory of civilization. As night thickened, the ward hummed. Serena could hear the machine's soft calculations in her chest. Nurses changed shifts like the turning of a page. Lucas watched the parking lot like it was a chessboard. Elias drifted between hope and apology. And Serena felt the world tilting in scales whose weights she did not choose. She dreamed a different negotiation in the edges of sleep. She stood on a beach that didn't belong to any map she'd studied, the sand warm as time. She held the crescent device in both hands. Elias stood beside her, his skin lit by a moon that had no name. Lucas stood at the boundary of sea and land in a uniform he never owned. The three of them, scientist, emissary, agent, formed a triangle that was both heart and law. "You don't trust me," she told Elias in the dream. "I trust your capacity for grief," he answered. "And you?" Lucas said to Elias. "Do you trust humans?" "I trust some of them," Elias replied, and looked at Serena. "I trust her." The dream broke on waking like a wave hitting reef. She opened her eyes to find Lucas at the glass, his silhouette ragged with worry. He tapped the console and the screen blinked alive with data. "Doctor," he said, "the infection markers are rising." The words were not entirely new. They'd spoken of them earlier. But now, hearing them again, the cold compressed in her chest. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "We will run more tests. We will see the trajectory." His voice tried to be kind and was only partially able. "We will also negotiate. I can open channels, but I need permission to act." Permission. The word had always been a portal. She could refuse to let them take the device. She could allow the architects to protect her, to seed knowledge into her and watch her die with a song. She could demand a coalition. She could refuse all and let the device lock away for good. Each path carried consequences like small, precise explosives. She thought of the janitor, of the nurse, of the daughter whose smile she had held onto through windows of fever and hope. She thought of Lucas, who had shoulders like an apology and a face that softened when he embroidered stories of his daughter's lost laugh. She thought, with a deeper certainty than before, of Elias, that impossible confluence of compassion and alien calculation who had said, "We do not harvest, we shepherd what can become." The night wore on, and the hum of the lights became a chorus of choices. Serena realized that the thing she feared most was not dying, but being used as a means to a purpose she could not face. Her hands trembled. The infection had staked a claim inside her nervous system that made fear swell into forms she did not fully control. With a breath that tasted of bleach and mint from the hospital sanitizer, she made a decision that felt like both surrender and revolution. "Open a channel," she said. Lucas' head snapped up. some line of protocol pulsing on his face. To whom? To the coalition I'm asking for, she said. Ethicists, independent oversight, people who have no stake in national power. If I am to be altered, let it be scrutinized. Elias's eyes glimmered like a night tide. You are brave, he said, quietly. And dangerous, he said. Which is the point, she said. If we are to be shepherded, let us shepherd our shepherds. Lucas hesitated, and in his hesitation she saw the slow work of a man choosing to become more than his orders. He keyed something into the console, the screen flaring with an officialness that made everything real in a way the dream could not. I'll try, he said. Outside, the world kept spinning in its small, clear-cut anxieties. Traffic, headlines, the quiet rituals of a city unaware of its new myth. Inside the ward, however, the axis shifted. The three of them found an uneasy alignment. They each had something the others needed. Serena had witnessing. Elias had knowledge and a culture that had touched the stars and bent them into gardens. Lucas had the power and the scars of someone who had seen secrecy wound as a blade. And beneath all of it, the device pulsed like a patient heart. It was not inert, not yet. It waited for permission, for guidance, for an offering. It would demand an answer in the language of molecules and choices. Serena pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the observation partition and let the hum of the lights measure the moments. Outside, Lucas and Elias negotiated the lines of a future that might be governed by their own limited benevolence. Inside, she prepared herself for the turning of the page, where the next act would peel back the architecture of intention and reveal the fractures beneath. She thought of the phrase Elias had once whispered at the edge of her dying. We do not harvest, we shepherd what can become. It had felt like salvation. Now, it felt like a challenge. Shepherds can lead to pastures or to slaughter. The choice would not be theirs alone. And as she lay there, fever tasting mildly of ozone, she realized with dreadful clarity that she had become a language between worlds, a translator between the architect's intentions and humanity's stubborn, complicated will. The question loomed like a distant star. Would she translate them into emancipation or into instruments? In those quiet hours, as the hum of the fluorescent lights became the metronome of her dwindling days, she understood that the real tension was not only between Elias and Lucas, but inside her own ribcage, where loyalty, curiosity, and the indeterminate force of the device warred for the final say. The first fracture came quietly, a small human thing that had nothing to do with governments or alien ethics and everything to do with a single misplaced trust. Serena woke to the sound of voices arguing, low and urgent in the corridor. Lucas and someone else, papers shuffling, the metallic clack of a keycard. She pushed herself up and saw, through the observation glass, Lucas moving with a speed that made his years of bureaucracy seem like a costume. Beside him, a woman she did not know, lab coat, tired eyes, a voice that scraped like gravel. The woman was carrying a slim case stamped with an insignia neither of Serena's institution nor of any international body she recognized. Elias stood back a step, his posture offering deference, but his face was a closed geometry. He did not like surprises. Consent, the woman said sharply. We have a mandate for a controlled release, not for an open, cross-border study. You promised containment. Lucas barked something under his breath. I promised a coalition review. That's different from releasing classified tech into an unstable network. The woman clicked the case shut like a judge slamming down a gavel. Then you must choose. The architects will not wait forever. Serena's heart, a complicated piston these days, half biological rumor, half pattern, stuttered. Architects? Wait. The phrase landed like a stone. Whoever this woman was, whichever authority she represented, she had the language of impatience that belonged to the kind of power used to issuing ultimatums. Lucas turned away from the glass, and his eyes found her. For a moment he looked as if he would speak, then he closed his mouth and walked toward a small monitor, typing so fast it made the keyboard complain. Elias followed the woman, talking low. From the slant of his shoulders, from the way his hands curled into the shape of apologies, Serena could tell the conversation she could not hear was not simple bargaining, but a countdown. It did not take long for the consequence to arrive. A memo that appeared on her bedside console like a guillotine of paper. It was labeled with the same insignia as the case and contained words the hospital had used earlier but used now like tools of reparation. Temporary custody, exempted asset, and the phrase Serena despised most. For the greater good. Greater good, she mouthed. The words had been used since tribes decided to sacrifice one to save many. Now they had been wrapped around her life like ceremonial cloth. She could feel the device under her pillow through the thin sheet, a crescent presence that made the skin along her hip prickle. It pulsed with a slow, patient glow that sounded uncannily like breathing. Elias's negotiations had always been framed as gentle coercions, a diplomacy that felt like leaning a ladder against a cathedral and promising not to climb. But the woman with the case, Ambassador Thera Khan, as Lucas later told her in a voice too weary and too angry to be pure authority, represented the architect's delegation. She had the hardness of someone who had watched planets be remade and decided that practical decisions could not be idealized. "We can quarantine the device," Thera told Lucas when she finally came to the glass. Her voice carried the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. "Or we can allow measured dissemination. The device is adaptive. It will respond to the first major directive it receives." "Which is?" Lucas demanded. Thera's eyes softened in a way that made Serena unnerved. "It is, by design, attracted to caretakers of systems. People like you, Dr. Marquez, who create patterns for living things. It will seek translation." Serena felt the sentence like an accusation. "Translation for whom?" she asked aloud. "For the architects," Elias said quietly. "They listen. They want to learn how societies make meaning from empathy. They adjust their methods accordingly." Lucas's temper broke like a loose wire. "You tell me they want to learn, that they care about consent, and yet you come with this, with an ultimatum?" Thera did not flinch. "We come with truth and with timelines. Your species moves slowly. Architects move on geological hours. We cannot be expected to wait centuries for polity to catch up." "Then you're going to make the choice for us?" Serena said, voice cracked but fierce. Thera inclined her head, not unkindly. "We can remove the node. We can silo its effects. Or we can seed it under your watch, with conditions." "Conditions like what?" Lucas demanded. "Transparency except for specific safety protocols," she said. "A council, shared oversight, a non-zero amount of human say in its programming. Detaining the device, sequestering it so completely that it could not be turned into a weapon, or letting it enter the public sphere under a guarded, multinational body, there were lines of power in both choices. But beneath the argument lay an even nastier truth. The architects, by virtue of their patience and reach, had time to wait out human indecision. They had time to observe how Lucas and his kind would choose. And they had the capacity to remove a node if the node refused to be the kind of seed they intended. In the middle of these negotiations, Lucas betrayed a different fracture. He walked away from the glass and left the console unlocked. It was a small human error, exhaustion and a moral calculation colliding in the same motion. But it mattered because Serena had learned how to navigate systems with the hunger of the desperate. She could access the hospital network. Her hands, once precise with instruments that measured parts per million, hovered over keys with a scientist's steadiness turned urgent. She pulled up the memo feed, the secure logs, the chats that shouldn't have been visible to someone in a bed. Names unfurled like a knotted rope, departments, contractors, back channels, and then one file that made the room tilt. Project Arcadia, consent exempt. The file was marked for a single signature, Lucas Marin. Her breath found a rhythm like a broken metronome. She opened the document and read with a fevered attention that almost pleased the infection. The device had been profiled on a dozen missions to nascent biospheres. The architects, the report said, did not harvest in the crude sense. They fostered. They rewired social incentives in a manner that accelerated cooperation and made colonization cheaper, cleaner, less violent. But the file also listed contingencies. If resistance persists, deploy containment protocol Epsilon. Epsilon. Death by protocol. The word swallowed her whole. She turned and watched Lucas, and under the rational uniform of his face, she saw betrayal, not like a blade, but like a slow rot. He had signed. He had filed the thing that allowed a triage council, controlled partially by architects' delegates, to take custody. He had done it, she knew then, because the daughter he had once lost had died in a quarantine breach, because he believed that keeping the world smaller saved it. He had traded her life for a system he believed would keep catastrophe at bay. Serena understood his logic. That made her fury feel traitorous. She wanted to run to the glass and scream at him that his trade was monstrous. Instead, she composed herself with a composure learned in labs. Note, hypothesis, action. She called Elias through the ward speaker. His voice answered, low and immediate. "They're moving to take the device," she said. He exhaled. "Then we move too. What do you want me to do?" "Refuse," he said, categorically. "Refuse in a way that forces the architects to reveal their protocols." "That's a risk," she said. "If they prefer preservation, they'll trigger the failsafe." "If they trigger preservation," Elias said, "then they'll reveal their limits. And perhaps from those limits, we can build a choice no one can sign away." Serena felt the impossibility like a cold wave. She also felt, more fiercely, a clarity she had not expected. This was the fracture, not only between Lucas and Elias, not only between architects and humans, but between theory and living flesh. She had to decide whether to be the instrument or to be the person who refused to be instrumented. She refused. At the next meeting, when Lucas and Thera and Elias stood on opposite sides of the hospital's negotiation room and treaties were read like liturgies, Serena's refusal slid into the center of the table like a stone. She spoke in a voice that carried the fever of someone who had seen both cosmos and cradles. "I will not allow my body to be used as a testbed without an independent mandate," she said. "You think you're choosing the lesser of evils, but the lesser evil is still theft. If the architects want to learn, let them do it with consent that is traceable, reversible, and humane." Thera's face remained unreadable. Lucas sat like a man remembering his daughter's broken laugh, the lines around his eyes deeper with grief and calculation. He said quietly, "Doctor, with respect, your position endangers many people." "And your position endangers what matters," she said. "If you believe secrecy is protection, then you're asking us to surrender our agency." Elias looked at her with a tenderness that both warmed and terrified. "There is another path," he said, "one that acknowledges the architect's methods but insists on our sovereignty. Let the device teach those who choose to listen in a controlled cohort of volunteers. Not one person, not one mandate. A council, transparent, international." Lucas's hands clenched. "Do you trust him? Do you trust an emissary who represents a species that designs societies?" I trust her, Elias said, surprising them both. I trust Dr. Marquez. There was a silence like the intake of a lung. Lucas leaned back, the chair creaking. For a man of his training, of his orders, making a human decision felt almost illegal. He rubbed his eyes. "We have hours," he said. "Maybe less." Serena felt the infection's pressure like a timer. She had made her choice in the thin dividing line between hope and fear, and now she had to live with the consequences. Whether she had chosen defiance or the most honest stewardship, the fractures were not healed. They had simply become visible. Late that night, when the negotiation adjourned without a resolution, Lucas found her at the window of her ward, looking at the hospital lights like constellations gone domestic. He stood with a resignation that made his badge look ridiculous. "You could have signed it," she said. "You could have given them what they wanted." "I could have," he said, "and then I would have to live with it." "Are you living now?" She watched his hands, the way they folded into each other as if prayer was no longer an option. He opened his mouth. For the first time since the crash, he spoke not as an agent of containment, but as a man. "I kept a file," he said, "a copy of the signatures and a draft clause. I left it unfinalized because I hoped you would convince me to do otherwise." "So you were choosing on my behalf," she said. "That makes you complicit." "I'm choosing with you now," he said. "If we bring the coalition, if we insist on consent-based cohorts, I'll help protect the process." She wanted to hate him. Instead, she felt a strange, guilty gratitude. He had signed the file once, but he had left room to change it. Perhaps that was the only mercy he could offer, the chance to undo his worst judgment. Around them, the ward hummed with its own small life. The device under the pillow pulsed like a truth that could not decide whether to be gentle or inevitable. Serena understood, with a scientist's terrible clarity, that nothing would end cleanly. Secrets had been revealed. Fractures had become fissures. Relationships, between men and cultures, between power and principle, had split. But the split also created an opening. It forced a negotiation not only between nations and alien architects, but between versions of the human self. The one that trusted systems and the one that trusted one another. That space would be dangerous, messy, and wide enough to let in the light. She let out a breath that tasted faintly of ozone and hospital coffee and the salt of pretended seas. For the first time since the crash, the fear in her chest was braided with something else, an odd, fierce hope. If the architects listened, if humans could insist on being more than instruments, perhaps the species would find a way to shepherd themselves. When Lucas left that night, he did it with a promise rather than with orders. Elias stayed, pacing like a man unused to the slow cruelty of human timetables. And Serena, with the device tucked like a secret in her bed, waited for morning and for the inevitable reckoning that would define what kind of stewards they would become. Night had teeth. The hanger lice threw everyone into relief. Lucas, a man folded by duty, Elias, a silhouette of impossible patience, and Serena, pale in a hospital gown with the crescent device tucked against her like contraband and confession. The room smelled of oil and ozone. The crane above them looked like a rib cage of a god. There was a bolt of raw publicness to the place, as if whatever they did here would be recorded by the sky. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. They had brought her because public negotiation had failed, and the architect's patience had the same steady cruelty as geological time. Farrakhan insisted on a neutral facility. Lucas argued it into being. Elias negotiated terms that smelled of compromise. And Serena arrived because she was the pivot no protocol could refuse. The hangar was a cathedral of commerce and rumor, full of men and women whose faces either authorized or buried futures. Serena felt their stares like drafts. "Serena," Lucas said, voice low. He'd given up his badge for the night, but the lines of command sat in him like old armor. He took her hand for a moment, quick as a reflex and twice as necessary. "If this goes wrong." "It might," she said. She looked at Elias then, and the air between them thickened with everything they'd never said. "Then we make the wrongness meaningful." Elias's hand hovered just above hers, not daring to close the space. "We could isolate the node. We could let it teach a cohort," he said. The architect's delegation had wanted speed. Elias, more weary than dignified, pleaded for patience he didn't always practice. Farah did not pretend to be swayed. "We will not wait beyond our window," she said. "If you refuse to consent to any measured exchange, the failsafe triggers. Preservation, then silence." Serena knew what that meant in bone. Preservation was a polite word for dormancy. Dormancy for many species meant a kind of museumization, kept, not engaged. She had been offered silence when she asked for speech. It had shocked her then. Now it tasted like ash. "Call the cohort," Lucas said. His voice surprised both of them. "If there must be witnesses, let them be the ones we chose together." Farah's face was carved into the discipline of someone who made planetary decisions. She looked at Elias, then at Lucas, then at Serena. "You have 10 minutes to sign the temporary charter that allows a controlled cohort, or our line opens the failsafe." They moved like people in an old film, hands grappling for pens, stamps slamming, signatures made. Serena felt the device rest against her ribs like a slow heartbeat. The cohort was an imperfect mercy. It meant the device could not be sealed away the instant she refused. It meant, too, that a handful of people would be welcomed into the architecture of an experiment that would alter how they felt and how they loved. That thought landed with sometimes ecstatic terror. Lucas crouched to be level with her. "We can protect anonymity. We can build protocols you demand. We will make it reversible." "You will have to trust me to help design the protocols," Serena said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her words. The infection had given her a kind of empathy not unlike an instrument. It translated motives into waves. She could feel the cohort like an organism, fragile, eager, dangerous. Elias watched her with an expression that made her feel unaccountably naked. "If you are the translator, then let them hear what translation can mean," he said. "Not the architect's plan only, but your reading of it." Lucas's jaw flexed. The man who had once authorized containment now found himself bargaining for mercy with the very being he feared to embrace. He nodded once, sharp as a blade's notch. "Then sign," he said, "and tell me what you need." Serena signed. The pen left a small, trembling signature, an artist's line on a contract that might decide love's legality. The cohort would include ethicists, humanists, a linguist, a janitor who had been vocal in his desire to be allowed to care, and a nurse whose daughter had drawn a galaxy and given it to Serena as a talisman. Their selection was a moral collage. They were not a majority, but they were a representation of the fragile dignity she wanted to save. They moved then into the preparation room like conspirators. Lab coats and diplomatic robes brushed shoulders. Technicians set up quiet microphones. Cameras floated like surgical stars. Serena felt every eye on her, as if she were a bridge between species. Elias lingered near, his hand finally closing over hers. There was the smell of the sea about him, a sadness like wet stone. "If we do this," he murmured, "I will not promise it will be easy. I will promise I will be here." "You say that as a man who shepherds," she replied. Her thumb rubbed the crescent surface through the cloth. It thrummed like a contained thought. "Do shepherds stay when the sheep refuse the pasture?" "They stay," he said. "Or they leave, and the landscape dies on schedule." Outside the windows, the world waited with its own hunger: reporters, governments, families. Inside, the cohort entered the room with solemnity like a small, uncertain flock. They sat at the semicircle of tables, faces crisscrossed with fear and hope. Elias stood at the head of the room and addressed everyone with a voice that felt like both translation and judgment. He explained not the full history, architects did not reveal everything, but enough to make the stakes palpable. He told the cohort about seeding and about ethics and about how empathy could be used as a metric to accelerate cooperation. His language was careful, like walking between glass. "And this device?" the linguist asked. "It adjusts," Elias confirmed. "It seeks patterns and amplifies those patterns into social affordances. It is a lever. Who pulls it determines the architecture." "You cannot design a lever for empathy without changing love itself," the janitor said, voice rough as gravel. "You are right," Elias said. "That is why consent is central." Serena looked at them all. They were not an army. They were a congregation of imperfect witnesses. And in that moment, with the device under her shirt like a small, heavy moon, she made the decision that would be remembered not as a demolition of conspiracy, but as a fragile insistence on human agency. She would not let the device be used as a camouflage for harvesting. She would let it teach, but only through voluntary translation and reversible consent. If the architects wanted to learn, they would do so with witnesses who could retract. If the world wanted knowledge, it would earn it. The protocol they signed was messy, complicated, and honest. It allowed for the device to interface with a closed cohort under strict observation, with rolling consent checks, with psychological firewalls, and with the power to halt. It barred monarchical control by any single nation or alien delegate. It gave Serena veto power over any dissemination. It required Lucas to publish certain redacted findings on timelines that could not be amended without coalition approval. When the time came for the device to open to the cohort, Serena felt the universe tilt as if she were the axis. Technicians connected soft leads to the crescent. The cohort sat on chairs that had been leveled like confessionals. The first interface was gentle, a low harmonic that made the edges of the hanger sing. Serena closed her eyes. Instead of being invaded, she felt the device read her like a music sheet, not cold, not purely calculating, but attentive. Elias stood close, his breath warm at her temple. Lucas watched from the doorway, a sentinel who had traded orders for a fragile faith. The device licked at the edges of the cohort's empathy like a tacit tutor, amplifying kinship signals, tuning reward centers toward cooperation. It was intoxicating and terrifying. Within minutes, the janitor cried openly when asked what he loved. The linguist recited a poem that made the nurse clutch her badge. But in the midst of revelation came an alarm. The device pulsed a frequency outside the planned band, a signature that hinted at dormant preservation protocols. The hangar's light stuttered. Thermographs blipped. Theris delegates bristled with the readiness of those who keep safekeeping as their god. "Containment now," Thera ordered. Elias moved like a man who had seen such moments before, and Serena watched him with a love that had the sharpness of cliffs. "No," he said, voice like a command and a prayer. "Wait, we can negotiate the bandwidth. Let the cohort retract if they wish." A hand in the cohort, a young nurse who had drawn galaxies for her child, shook. Tears tracked down her face. She looked at Serena and said, "Please don't take this away, not yet." The decision was sudden and human. Serena understood, in a new, precise way, what the architects had meant by messy. Consent gathered like a chorus and fell back like a tide. One by one, members of the cohort tapped the retract mechanism and then, after breath, untapped it. The device adjusted to the ebb and flow of choice. It hummed an answer that was not architecture alone, but an accord. Thera's face had the slight collapse of someone whose cosmic patience had been undermined by human stubbornness. "You are complicating our timeline," she said. "We are choosing ourselves," Lucas shot back, and for once his words sounded less like a shield and more like a plea. "This is our sovereignty." The device did something then that few thought machines could do. It listened. It mapped the knot of consent and reverence in the room and replied not by commandeering but by modulating, softening its reach where people retracted and deepening connection where they chose. The architect's boons, what had once been a terrifying unilaterality, were now being negotiated like a dance. In the end, the greatest sacrifice was neither Elias nor Lucas. It was Serena's. The interface needed a translator who would remain within the system long enough to train a cohort and test reversibility. The choice was this. She could leave the node dormant and safe, or she could bind herself to the translation sequence long enough to ensure the cohort could disengage at will. To steward that translation, she would have to remain connected for an indefinite period. It would not end deathly at once, but it would slow freeze certain freedoms while granting others back to billions. She looked at Lucas. He was the man who had signed and unsigned and then signed again on the side of human dignity. "If I stay," she said, "I will not be alone." Elias put his forehead to hers then, a gesture both alien and intimate. "I will be with you," he promised. "Where you translate, I will help shepherd." Lucas, who had lived by the ledger of containment, reached out and placed both his hands over theirs. The gesture was not an order. It was a benediction of flawed men. "I will oversee protocol compliance," he said, the word oversee tasting like both penance and devotion. "And I will be here when you step back." Serena let the crescent rise against her sternum and made the choice to stay, to become the bridge not in death but in patient living. It was a sacrifice that would ripple through her life. Privacy traded for guardian witness. Freedom rerouted into a covenant. As the month began, days tallied by the gentle hums of the device rather than the fluorescent lights, Serena lived in a narrow orbit of translation. She trained the cohort, set the fail-safes, and taught people how to retract. Elias sat nights at her side, speaking in foreign title metaphors that made her dream of oceans she had never seen. Lucas sent her daily reports, and once, a photograph of a sunflower he said reminded him of something he'd wanted to protect. They were not lovers in any tidy mythic sense, and yet their entwined grief and stubbornities warmed into a rare kind of intimacy. Elias loved her in a way that made constellations of apology. Lucas loved her the way men love what they have failed and therefore intend to.